Hey, Push Nation, how's your weekend going? I'm checking in here for our weekend Fireside chat, and the topic still remains for us today on the Constitution and how it all played out and came together to give us the framework of our current government. We left off looking at the three central issues that were involving the Constitution's drafting on Friday's class. Issue number one was representation. How would the states be represented in a Congress? And we talked about how the Connecticut plan solved that. Issue number two is where we left off, which was on slavery. I kept reiterating the point. It was not a moral issue as far as the Constitution was concerned. It was an issue over representation. How would slaves count towards representation? And to get into the specifics of exactly what the Constitution determined, I'm going to bring in our friend Misha Trivedi here to explain to you the Three-Fifths Compromise. So Misha, it's all yours.
Hey, Push Nation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Three-Fifths Compromise. So before we get into the specifics of the actual compromise, it's important to understand just why it was necessary. So prior to being unified under the single government of the United States of America, the colonies were of course separate. Their economies, their culture, and their ways of life evolved in distinctly different manners from one another. One particularly strong separation was between the northern and southern economies, which contributed to their way of life and their culture and all that. So the southern colonies, of course, had more slaves because they needed them to tend to their plantations and their cash crops and all those fun things. So fast forwarding to the Continental Congress of 1783, which was called to revise the Articles of Confederation, one of the central issues was deciding how the populations of each state would be counted. More specifically, the debate was over whether, and if so, how, slaves would be counted when determining a state's population for taxation purposes. So James Madison suggested the Three-Fifths Compromise at the Continental Congress of 1783. Essentially, the Three-Fifths Compromise stated that when counting a state's population, a slave counted as 3/5 of a person. But since it required a unanimous vote to pass under the Articles of Confederation, and New Hampshire and Rhode Island rejected it, the Three-Fifths Compromise did not pass. When the Constitutional Convention, which is the gathering of delegates where the actual Constitution for the United States was drafted, when that met in 1787, the issues of counting the population of states was even more intense. Because before this, it was just taxes. But after the adoption of the Connecticut Compromise into the Constitution, the number of people in each state and how each state's population was counted was super, super important. Because the number of representatives each state received in the House of Representatives depended on each state's population. So the more people you had, the more representatives you received in the House. So what you said as a state had much more weight. The southern states wanted the slaves to be counted because that meant that they got more representation, since their population was there were so many slaves in their population. Like South Carolina, where a majority of their population was actually enslaved. So at the Constitutional Convention, James Wilson and Roger Sherman proposed Madison's Three-Fifths Compromise again to solve the problem of how a state's population is counted. The adoption of this plan resulted in the South having more power in the U.S. Congress. There were 5 super hardcore slave states. So because of that, those were the southern states, and they had about 38% of the seats in the Continental Congress. But because of the 1787 Three-Fifths Compromise, the southern states had nearly 45% of the seats in the first U.S. Congress, which took office in 1790. So the big takeaway or recap from all of this is that the Three-Fifths Compromise said that a slave counted as 3/5 of a person in the national census. And the compromise was drafted because of taxation and legislative debate, not because of a moral debate as to whether slavery was allowed or whether it should be abolished or how much of an actual person a slave was. This was just for counting purposes. So back to you, Mr. Smith.
All right, Misha, thank you very much for giving us that breakdown on the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, the Three-Fifths Compromise did appear in the Constitution. However, it was not the only literature in the Constitution that also addressed slavery. There was a separate article within the Constitution that talked about that the slave trade would eventually be revised and relooked at in about 20 years. So that meant by 1808, the government would again look at the policies of the slave trade. But as Misha correctly stated, now we've got the issue of slavery under the Constitution. It's in terms of a representation issue. Our third issue to look at is quite simply just a debate over executive power. How much executive power should the commander-in-chief, the executive branch, possess was on the minds of all the drafters of the Constitution that were at the Federation Convention in Philadelphia. I don't really want to get into this too much. It just reminds you again that really the revolution was on the minds of everyone still. The fear of tyranny, the fear of a monarchical government, and sort of what gets eventually worked into the Constitution is the role of president, the head of the executive branch. It was suggested, although not written, that the president serve 4 years. Also, the provisions for electing the president, of course, were determined. It would not be based on popular vote. It would not be based on state legislatures. It would instead be based on this electoral college process, which we know still holds up. But it's interesting to note that despite the fear of the, repeating a mistake from the British government, although Alexander Hamilton probably would have loved that British style of government, as we talked about on Friday, the president was given an awful lot of power, especially being commander-in-chief of the army. So with those issues settled, and look, again, I realize we're breaking things down so narrowly. I want to turn instead to the debate that we're going to get into on Monday, and that's going to sort of, the next segment of this Fireside Chat is really going to give you guys some things to think about as you craft your arguments. Now, with the Constitution being written by the end of 1787, on September 28th, 1787, the process for ratification would begin. And in order for the Constitution to be ratified, it was determined that each state, with the exception of Rhode Island, which did not send a delegate to the Federation Convention, it was determined that for the Constitution to be passed, you would have to have 9 states ratify the Constitution. So, in other words, 3/4 of the 13, roughly. This was a revolutionary process. It really is. And if you think about the scope of what's trying to be accomplished here, the Articles of Confederation were totally obliterated. A brand new framework of a government is written. And now it was really a matter of, would the states accept this new document? And there was a lot of nervous people. There were a lot of nervous people, especially James Madison, who was one of the main architects of the Constitution. And Madison and people like Alexander Hamilton, that were very ardent nationalists, wanting to unify the country around one document. The worry that really begins to permeate in the states is a question over states' rights versus federal rights. And perhaps, this is a little bit of opinion here, but perhaps one of the most beautiful elements of the Constitution is the idea of federalism. This idea that within one government you have 2 layers of power. The first layer, of course, is at the state level. The states all have their own constitutions. They all have their own assemblies or legislatures, and they all have their own governors. So they have an executive branch, and they even have their judiciary court system. And yet you have that layer at the federal level that works exactly the same way. Montesquieu would have been very proud of the fact that you have a layer of free branch of government at the state level and then at the federal level. But the core concept that was embedded in the Constitution was the idea of federalism, in that when in doubt, issues between state and federal would win out. And that is a really important debate, though, in terms of the ratification. There were a number of people who were anti-federalist, meaning they did not like the concept of federalism because they felt it suffocated the states too greatly. Some key names I'm going to give you. One of the leading anti-federalists was actually Patrick Henry, who we know we had the infamous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Patrick Henry was very much in support of states' rights. And a lot of people like Patrick Henry that fell on the anti-federalist side, including Samuel Adams as well, was another name from the Revolution that was an anti-federalist. They voiced concern over something as small as the first opening of the Constitution, which is "We the People." They felt that they left out the states. It should have been "We the States." So the question of whether this government would be directed towards the people of the United States and that social contract, the very Lockean, Rousseauian concept of social contract, people were shocked, really, when they saw the Constitution because it generally dealt more with, in terms of the relationship between the people and the government versus the states and the federal government. So the Anti-Federalists really took up the cause of trying to question and debate the issue of federalism and the extent at which federalism would prevail. And that's really, again, what the ratification process was like. It was a debate. And this broke out in all sorts of formats. The one you're dealing with right now over the weekend in trying to prepare for our in-class debate would have much been like what happened at the time in the state assemblies and the state ratification groups to decide whether or not to accept the Constitution. And really, the ultimate manifestation is not unlike what happened in the Revolution. The debaters turned to writing. Both groups, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, published numerous papers, the essays, some of which you're reading for the debates, and these would be printed in newspapers. And both sides would try to sort of garner support for their position in the newspaper articles that eventually morphed into these Federalist papers or Anti-Federalist papers. Now, the Federalist position, of course, was mainly to protect the power of the Constitution by really putting the federal government at the forefront. And the Federalist papers that you're reading, just a little background on those, they were published under an alias by three men in particular. Alexander Hamilton, and really the Federalist papers were his main idea, James Madison, and then another guy, John Jay, who becomes the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And they all wrote these essays, and what's really crazy is that they were writing them so frequently that a lot of these essays were first drafts, which kind of humbles you as a writer to look at what they produced versus what we write all the time. And they published the drafts under one name, Publius, Publius. This was a pseudonym they came up with. And it kind of represented the idea that no one knew who these articles were being written by, but the Federalist papers were published and printed all throughout New York and other states to sort of win support for the Federalist cause. So when it came time to ratifying the Constitution, the Federalists would prevail. So really, the Federalist job was to defend the Constitution, to defend their positions. The Anti-Federalists were attacking the power of the federal government over states, and also they were really clamoring for a Bill of Rights. This was the main argument presented by the Anti-Federalists. They feared that with such a strong federal government, the rights of the people would be ignored. And that proves to be one of the most important arguments of the Anti-Federalists, aside from more or less bashing some of the federalism concepts that are embedded in the Constitution. So this debate will rage until, of course, eventually the Federalists, in historical terms, as we know, win out. But for Monday, I want to see how you guys take this. And I want the judges, especially who are listening, to make sure that when you vote, you know where history goes with this debate. I want you to really just listen carefully to the arguments of your classmates to make these decisions. So I'm very much looking forward to this. And just a reminder how it's going to work. You guys are going to come in to class, and please get in your groups right away. As soon as you come into the classroom, I want the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists organized, and then the judges, of course, get organized as well. I'll split you guys up. The judges are going to work in the hallway, right, working on their questions, and the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are going to kind of work together to create a sort of broad-based arguments for each side. That should last about 10 minutes, and then the actual debates and whatnot will last about 20 minutes. And then we're going to put everything together into one sort of final discussion, about a 15-minute discussion to kind of wrap things up, talk about some neat little, I have another anecdote to share with you guys on Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Papers. But I'm really excited for how this is going to play out, and I hope you guys are too. It will be our very first pro se court. Also, check your emails later if you haven't already done this for the copy of the Bill of Rights. We are having that quiz on Tuesday, and I look forward to that. Having some fun drafting up those word problems for you guys. So all that being said, I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend whenever you're watching this. And as always, remember, the past shapes the future. Take care.